Welcome to the Widowed Parent Podcast with your host, Jenny Lisk.
Hey everyone, it's Jenny Lisk, and this is episode 25 of the Widowed Parent Podcast. I had such a great discussion with Kris Marsh for this episode. I've had listener requests to hear from some people who really struggled after losing a parent at a young age. Kris lost her mom to suicide when she was just 19 years old, and she didn't get the support that she now realizes she needed. She became, in her words, a classic overachiever in order to avoid dealing with her pain and loss. This continued until she approached the age her mom was when she died, at which point she couldn't avoid dealing with it any longer. I'll let you listen to Kris tell her story in her own words. She now feels strongly that grieving kids need support, and that just because they seem okay doesn't necessarily mean they are. I'm so glad Kris was willing to share her story with us. I hope you enjoy my discussion with Kris Marsh. My guest today is Kris Marsh, who is joining us from her home office in Michigan. Kris, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'm really glad to be speaking with you today because I really do think that it's helpful for widowed parents to hear from people who lost a parent when they were young. And more specifically, I've actually heard from some requests from listeners to hear from people who have struggled after losing a parent. And I think that people would like to hear what sometimes doesn't go so well so they can maybe be on the lookout for things that might come up with their kids and just generally figure out how to better support them. So thank you again for speaking with me today. And to start us off, could you just set the stage a little bit? I'd like to hear a little bit about your life before your mom died, before everything changed. Kind of what was life like as a child and a teenager?
Probably fairly typical. So my mom and dad were together. We were a family of four. My brother is just a year older than me. So we grew up together, and I would say that pretty typical to that time, which would have been the 70s and the 80s. My mom stayed at home and took care of the kids in the home, and my dad went to work. And so very much in that sense, she was the glue or the gel that held the family together. And I think that every family has that person, right, that is the glue that brings everyone else together, and they make sure that people don't drift apart from each other.
Yeah. Okay. And so then, at some point, something changed. So what happened? What changed for you?
So when I was still a teenager, I lost my mom to suicide, and I think that is also an important point to all of the things that I can share about the perspective. And that's been 29 years ago. And so I have a long history of being able to reflect back at how that loss affected me, not only at the time, but since then in practically every aspect of my life. And the last year in particular has really been a journey of healing for me as I've allowed myself some reflection to look back and, for the first time really in a lot of ways, understand how that loss impacted me and get a sense of the support that I wish that I had during that time.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I'm looking forward to really diving deep with you on that. At first, you were how old when your mom died?
2 weeks after I turned 19.
Okay. Wow. And so were you then in college at that point?
I had started college, and then after the loss of my mom, I just couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't focus. And so I had to take a break from college. I did ultimately go back and earn a bachelor's degree and earn a master's degree. But it really did put the brakes on my life for about 2 years after that loss.
So what were those first 2 years, say, like those early days? Looking back, what was the hardest maybe for you at that point?
Looking back, what I remember was a feeling of not belonging, which is strange because I grew up with a fairly large extended family. My dad was around, my brother was around, but we had that close connection with our mom, as I said, being that person that generally kept the family running, kept the family together. And so I remember feeling really lost and disconnected. And the best way that I would know how to describe it was kind of felt like a balloon that had been cut from a string. And so it's just kind of floating away. And I think that the thing is, children are masters at masking their feelings and developing coping mechanisms. And so an important point that I make when I speak with people now who have, there's a child in their life that has experienced the loss of a parent, is that just because they look okay, it doesn't mean that they are, right? And so I was 19, which I was at this strange point in my life where I was starting to pull away and become independent, but very much still relying on that force of having a mother in the home and in my life. But I think that if you just take kids at face value, that they seem like they're being really strong, they seem like they're okay, they're doing all right. Really, that child needs someone to step in and guide them to accepting the help that they need to be able to heal. Because even at the age of 19, I didn't understand what I needed. So I can imagine for children that are younger than that, you're really not going to understand. And so someone needs to be that guiding force to not allow them to just drift away and say that they're okay, but be the person that brings them back in and guides them to that help.
Okay. Yeah. And so you feel then that nobody was that guiding force for you?
Yeah, and this is the interesting or sad reality of having a loss be the loss of a parent. Because very often that parent is the connection point and the person who is looking out for that child and guiding them, right? And making sure that they have what they need.
Right.
So I think that, my perspective is when the parent that has been lost is that primary caregiver parent, everyone else involved can be afraid to overstep boundaries with filling that role. And so when you have that happen, you have this child that feels, again, like that balloon that's been cut from the string. They feel a bit lost, and if no one, they're not going to ask for the help that they need. And so if no one steps in to that role to become that guide that they need in their life, they're not going to seek that out themselves. And so as I think back to when this happened, it's been 29 years ago now, if there were one thing that I could say, boy, I wish that this had been done, or I wish that this had happened and it would have helped. I wish that someone would have stepped in to not fill that role, because you can't fill the role of a parent, right? You can't replace a parent, but to step in and fill that nurturing role and not allow me to just say, I'm okay, but pull me back in and say, no, you're not okay, and that's okay. And we're going to figure out how to get you through this process that you need to get through.
Yeah. I can imagine that can be tricky if someone is college age and they're trying to be independent and trying to be adults and start their own lives, and yet they still need that support. And somehow, I guess how to successfully step in and help in a way that they're going to accept could be tricky.
Yeah, it could be. I've seen a similar thing happen, though, when, unfortunately, my son, one of his friends lost his mom when I think the boys were about 10 years old, so quite a bit younger. But it felt like a similar experience that was happening to him. And so, I do think that it can be uncomfortable for people to try to figure out how to step in and fill that void and help guide them to the help that they need. But it's very similar to when someone gets a critical terminal diagnosis of their health, or if someone has lost someone that they were close to. Let's say it's not a parent, but anyone that they were close to. We as humans tend to get uncomfortable with that, and we don't know what to say, so we don't say anything sometimes, right?
Yep.
And we're afraid to bring it up because we don't want to make the person sad, or we don't want to remind them of what happened. But the fact is, they haven't forgotten, right?
Right. Yep.
And so, just letting people know that, yeah, that child has not forgotten, and I think that it's healthy and it's healing to allow them and encourage them to talk about that parent that they've lost, to talk about that parent yourself and the memories that you have, and to keep going back and pulling them back in and pulling them closer to you and letting them know that you're not going to give up and let them drift away or withdraw into themselves, and just be there. And sometimes being there is just sitting quietly with someone if they don't want to talk. Right. And so the other thing that we'll see people do is that if someone is grieving and they don't want to talk, someone might assume that they just want to be left alone. Well, there's power in just sitting quietly with someone. Right. And then there's power in on the days that they want to talk and share, allow them to do that. But I think there's even more power in sitting quietly with them and not leaving the room and not leaving them alone, because that's a pretty powerful, tangible message that you're not going anywhere and that you're going to continue to be there for them.
Yeah. Such an important point. And I think what I'm taking away from this part of the discussion is that even if it's hard to reach out, even if you don't know if they're going to accept it or whatever, that it's worth figuring out how to be that support and offer that to that young adult, because they do still need it.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. And so you mentioned that you were in college and then you took a little bit of time off, and then at some point you went back. So how did you make that decision, or what changed that it now made sense for you to restart your education?
Let me think about that. So a couple of years had gone by, and I was working, I think, 3 jobs at the time, just trying to pay bills. And I realized that it was a point that I had a decision to make, that I needed to move forward if I wanted to finish and complete the things that I wanted to complete. But more so, and I'm just thinking out loud here, right? You can probably tell I'm reflecting as you asked that question. But
yeah, no, this is great.
I do remember there being a point about 2 years after the death of my mom that I woke up one day and I felt a little bit better. And there's no other better way that I know to describe it. I wouldn't say I was healed, because I don't know that you ever heal completely from something like that. But I just remember the days being so dark all the time for a couple of years. And I remember waking up one day and realizing that the sun was shining. And it felt like the time to move forward. And I think that something for me that was very personal that made the decision a bit easier was when I was very young, 4, 5, 6 years old. My mom worked in the kitchen at a school here in Michigan called Northwood University, the private business school. And I remember being there on the campus from time to time, waiting for her to get out of work. And one memory in particular, my brother and I were in the kitchen and we were sitting on this long stainless steel counter where they prepared food. And someone that she worked with got some quarters and went and got us a candy bar out of the vending machine. And that was so great. And I remember the bells ringing from the church tower on the campus. And I was so little, but I remember thinking, boy, it would be cool to go to school here someday. And so, yeah, so when I did go back to school, that is the university that I went to. And so for me, there was some healing in being on that campus and having those memories. And then, you know, it felt really good to graduate walking on that stage and just thinking, this is where my mom worked in the kitchen, and now I get to walk across the stage. So yeah. I think in retrospect, I didn't know it at the time, but now looking back, I think it really was part of the healing journey for me to do that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. And then I think that you said you then continued your education with a master's. And so I guess I'm thinking about how do you feel like your mom's death kind of shaped your career choices and kind of the way you pursued that aspect of your life?
So remember a few minutes ago when I said that children are masters at masking their feelings and developing coping mechanisms. Mm-hmm. I became the classic overachiever. Mm. So I didn't know it at the time, but my coping mechanism was to stay really busy and to continue to achieve, because if you stay really busy, you can't think about what has happened or the things that you should be processing internally. Mm. And so what I've learned over the years, this is a really common coping mechanism. And many times it's misidentified as someone being really strong, someone being really driven, someone being really determined. But if you look at that, very often when you see people that are so driven, there's a reason for that. And so my whole life I had heard people say, "Oh, you've been through so much. You're so strong. You're so amazing that you were able to move past that and rise above it." But what they didn't understand, and I didn't understand myself at the time really, was that was my coping mechanism, to keep moving so that you didn't have to think about it.
Interesting. So why do you think you felt that you had to be strong? Was it because so many people were telling you were strong, or like what do you think is underneath that?
I think it was back to that feeling that I had, I was this balloon that had kind of been cut from a string. So another thing that was interesting when I reflect back is, so I told you I had a pretty large extended family, but I really lost touch with the majority of them after my mom passed. Oh. And when I think about why that happened, so we all probably know that a death can either pull a family together or it can completely tear them apart. And the key, I believe, is having someone who is that connection point in that time of tragedy or crisis that will step forward and be that leader to keep everyone pulled together. Well, sometimes or often that person that would play that role is the parent that was lost. Okay. So I can tell you from my experience, let me think about this. So when you're a child and you're at a family birthday party or family holiday, mm-hmm. you go off and you play with cousins and you talk to other people, but you generally keep kind of coming back and touching base with your parent, right? Because that's your safe place. You keep kind of coming back to that. And if you run out of things to talk about, then you orbit around the parents again, right? You end up in your little clique family of four for a while. Mm-hmm. So this is the other thing that I think would be important for extended family to know. When a child has lost a parent, that's a really strange feeling to have, even though you're still in the company of your family, not to have that kind of safe base, right? Sometimes the parent plays the part of being that connection point, that safe place where the child keeps coming back. But also that parent can also be the buffer that helps that child communicate with extended family that they may not know yet how to communicate with, or they may not feel like they have much in common with yet, or they just don't know as well, or they're children, so they're just not comfortable in that situation. Mm-hmm. So with the loss of a parent, for me, even at the age of 19, those family gatherings got really uncomfortable because I didn't have that touch base to come back to. Mm-hmm. And I didn't have that kind of buffer, right? Again, if you're at that family party and then people start to split off into their small, immediate family groups, and if you don't have that, it starts to feel, for me, it felt awkward. And so I did start to just drift away, and I didn't have anyone who, came out and pulled me back in and said, hey, no, we're not going to let that happen. We love you. We want you to come back. I think people thought that I was doing what I needed to do, and they weren't sure what to say, so they didn't do anything.
Ah, okay. Okay. Oh, that's interesting. Thank you for sharing that. So you mentioned on the career side becoming the classic overachiever as a way of coping. I'm also wondering, I guess, on the family side, I think since then you have your own family. I wonder how your experience losing your mom has affected, say, your own parenting now or your own family dynamic or relationship.
Yeah, it absolutely has impacted our family dynamic now. So our son is actually 18. He's going to be graduating high school in just a few weeks, and our daughter is 14.
Okay.
After our son was born, my husband bought me a book called Motherless Mothers. I can't remember the author. I have it on a shelf, so we can look it up. But I will tell you that book was profound for me, because after our son was born, I was experiencing feelings that didn't make any sense to me. And so, positively, I remember feeling after our son was born that I had this incredible hole in my heart that I didn't think would ever be filled, that all of a sudden felt full. And it was more than that, though, and I wouldn't even be able to articulate it more clearly than that. But I remember reading in the book this idea that when you lose a parent, you lose a child-parent connection. And so when you have a child of your own, very often you'll experience those feelings because you're gaining back that parent-child connection that you have not had for so long. Even though now you're the parent, it's still a really special connection, that parent-child bond that you've not had for so long.
Okay.
And then when our daughter was born 4 years later, I didn't expect to have the same, profound something happen, right? Other than we were having another child, and that was fantastic, and of course, love her so much. But what was so interesting about having our son first and then having our daughter was, when our daughter was born, I remember in the first few minutes after her birth feeling like looking at her and thinking, oh my gosh, I get it now. This is how my mom felt about me. Because, our son gave me back that parent-child connection. My daughter gave me back that mother-daughter connection that I hadn't had in so long.
Right. Okay.
So, my children, that experience of having my children was so much a part of that healing journey for me. But it was so interesting to experience that and not realize that even now, being the parent in that relationship, it gives you back that parent-child and mother-daughter bond that you haven't had. In terms of what it's done for me, affected me as a mother, anyone who knows me will tell you that I was extremely overly protective of my children when they were small. So it's that fear of having lost someone so close to you, and so you want to keep everyone else really close to you.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. So eventually then, I know when we talked before, you mentioned that something changed. I think around the time you were approaching the age when your mother died. Can you talk a little bit about what happened next, more recently?
Yeah, absolutely. So I had, about 2.5 years ago, I started experiencing a lot of physical symptoms, and something was wrong, and I had seen multiple doctors, and we were trying to figure it out. I was having unexplainable memory loss. I was having numbness in my extremities. I was having weakness in my hands. I was having pain in different parts of my body. And the doctors had ordered, they were trying to figure it out. I had brain MRIs. I had brain scans. I saw a neurologist. I had all kinds of blood work. I had ultrasounds. Then this culminated after about a year, a little longer than a year. After we had been doing all of these tests, I had a really bad earache. And so I went to our local urgent care center. And I said, I have a really bad ear infection. I thought I needed some antibiotics. And the doctor that came in, he took a look in my ear and he said, what else is going on? And he started asking me, are you experiencing, and he went through kind of this checklist in his head of different symptoms. And I said, yeah. And I thought, wow, I finally found the doctor that figured out what's wrong with me, right? I was like, something terrible. It's all of this stuff together.
And this is the urgent care doctor.
This is the urgent care doctor, yeah, after I've been to all of these specialists trying to figure out what was going on. And he just looked at me sincerely and said, there is nothing physically wrong with you, but there is something inside that needs to be fixed. You are so stressed out about whatever this is that it's manifesting all of these physical things. And like I said, he went straight through the checklist and told me what I had been feeling. So generally, I would say that a part of how the loss of my mother impacted me my whole life was I became an extremely analytical, logical thinker versus an emotional thinker, because that was harder for me to do. So I was surprised that when he told me that, I didn't internally feel like I needed to push back from that, because generally I would. And I left there thinking, I accepted it, and I left there thinking, I think he's right, but I don't know what it is.
Oh, so at this point, you didn't jump right to, it must be my mother dying when I was 19.
No idea.
Okay.
So then a month went by, and I started to experience anxiety that I had never had before my whole life. And so my husband, who's phenomenal, by the way, we started dating when we were 15, and we've been together ever since. So he was around for all of this. He gets it.
Okay.
And by the way, over the last 29 years, he was the one person in my life who tried to suggest over and over, you probably should talk to someone about this. You probably shouldn't just try to do this by yourself. But I was stubborn. So after this happened and my husband suggested that again, I said, all right, I'll make an appointment. And the more I thought about it, I realized all of these things started to happen the year that I turned 43, almost to the day on my 43rd birthday, which didn't make a lot of sense until I realized that means once I was 43, my next birthday, I was going to be 44, and that's how old my mom was when she died.
Oh, interesting.
So, yeah, this has been the last year. As I said, I've been on this journey of opening myself up to understanding that unprocessed grief, it manifests really at a cellular level. It's in your body. And for years, I was sick constantly, and I would always say, oh, I have such a bad immune system. I kept everything. And it turns out that it really was all of that stress that I consciously wouldn't even allow myself to realize. It was creating all kinds of things in my body, but it got to the point of really kind of getting serious about wanting to push itself out after I turned 43, because subconsciously I knew that birthday was coming up. And so it started manifesting in all of these other ways that I couldn't ignore anymore. At the time, I just didn't know what they were, and the doctors never asked if there was something stressful that had gone on, that had happened. So that was another learning for me as well, because I went back and I picked up that book that my husband had bought for me. So this author actually has two books. One is called Motherless Daughters, and the second one is called Motherless Mothers.
Oh.
And when I went back and read, what I learned was, wow, this is a really common phenomenon. This happens to people that have lost a parent at a young age. It is nearly certain, I can't substantiate that, I haven't done the research myself, but I've talked to a whole lot of people, and I've been reading a lot about it because I want to learn more about myself. It seems like it's nearly certain that if someone has lost a parent at a young age, when they start approaching that age themselves at which their parent died, this happens to them.
Really?
And yeah, I think it's an important point to share, because if you don't know that this is something, quote, normal, like what is normal, right? But if you don't know that this is something that's typical, you don't know to expect it, and so you can't get ahead of it and start to process through and deal with it, and it really sneaks up on you and it scares you.
So it sounds like, as a parent then, as the surviving parent, I should kind of keep in the back of my mind that years down the road, when my kids are approaching 44, which is when my husband died, that something might pop up for them, and maybe even be talking to them about it, or somehow making them aware to keep their eyes open.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. A couple of years before that, milestone birthday is coming up. Yeah, open up that line of communication. Absolutely. Let them know that they may start to experience some of these feelings, and that it's okay. And encourage them to talk to someone about it. The feelings that are typical that come along with approaching that age are these unreasonable fears, an unreasonable fear of dying. Right? Like I said, I'm an analytical person. I'm a logical person. I couldn't figure out why all of a sudden I was turning into what I felt was a hypochondriac. I was like, why is this happening? Why is everything freaking me out now?
Yeah.
It doesn't make sense. The other thing that's common is to start to have irrational fears about the people that you love the most dying. To start to experience anxiety and or panic attacks and or depression that don't make a lot of sense to you at the time if you don't understand what's going on, so you can start to process through it. So I think that that's really important. It's so far down the line, generally, when we're talking about children losing a parent, that it can be easy to forget that adult now, who was the child at the time, they're still going to be experiencing effects of that death that far in the future.
Yeah, I mean, in my kid's case, that'll be like 30 years from now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The other thing that I've discovered that was interesting to me, so as I said, my husband really encouraged me to go and start talking to someone, and so I did. For the first time in my life, I found a phenomenal counselor and spent about a year working with her and just processing through how I was feeling, why I was feeling that way. The other thing that I don't think that we realize or we don't consciously label is that for most of these kids, if not all, really they've been traumatized. And so when you start looking at the classic behaviors and symptoms of PTSD, you'll see that manifesting with these kids as they grow into adults. And some of that are those coping mechanisms that I talked about.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've been learning about traumatic grief and some of the ways that manifests itself and implications, and different from what they call, I think, adaptive grief. But yeah, bringing some of those PTSD elements in along with the grief. interesting, and I think important to understand what to look out for, to try to see, if your kid might be struggling with some of that.
Well, the thing that was interesting for me when when first of all, this counselor that I was working with kind of put that label out there, and then I started thinking about it. It's like, oh my gosh, yeah, what I went through was so traumatic. That makes perfect sense. So then I think if you know that sooner as a surviving parent, what you can start to watch for in your children are those triggers. So when you think about PTSD, there are things that trigger you back to those feelings, right? That's what it is. And so as a child, you may have certain triggers, and you may not know, because I certainly did not at the time, that particular thing affects you and makes you scared, nervous, sad. And so as a parent, I think that what I've seen with other children is that can manifest as misbehavior, right? And so a child loses a parent, and then the child starts to act out, or the child starts to withdraw. I think that it would be interesting and helpful for a surviving parent to start to keep track of when those things are happening, to start to see if you can find a pattern of what those triggers are that are affecting your children.
Okay, yeah, that's a really good point. And so you mentioned that your mom had died by suicide. Do you think that added an extra layer? I mean, there's lots of different ways parents might die, and there's a lot in common. But I think there are some unique. I hear, for example, that a death by suicide or by homicide is more likely to trigger a traumatic reaction, maybe than deaths by other causes. And sometimes there's that element of, shame, that people don't want to talk about it or be honest about it. I'm wondering if you have any observations or thoughts on that and how that might have impacted you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad that you kind of circled this back to talk about it, because this is so important. First of all, you'll notice that when I talk about it, I said that I lost my mom to suicide. So this is something else that I've been thinking a lot about, that usually we will say that someone committed suicide, right? Meaning that they did something intentionally to themselves that caused them to die. But when we refer to it that way, we're really missing the important part of that story, which is that you really lost that person to mental illness. And so if we start to change that narrative in even just a simple way from the beginning to say, hey, I lost someone to suicide. This isn't something that they wanted to do to themselves, right? This is a mental illness. But, absolutely, it adds an additional layer. So in addition to all of the feelings of grief, you have strong feelings of betrayal, that parent betrayed you. You have strong feelings of abandonment, strong feelings of shame and guilt, wondering what you could have done to change the situation. Now, this was an important learning for me that now I talk to people about, is that in my family, no one ever spoke about mental illness. And part of that maybe was the time, right? Like I said, when you're talking about the 70s and the 80s, there just wasn't as much conversation around mental illness. It was kind of hushed. So when I lost my mom, I didn't know really anything about mental illness. So it was shocking, and I didn't understand it. And I was also, in addition to feeling abandoned, betrayed, shame, guilt, I was mad. I was really, really mad at her for leaving. And that was compounded by the fact that no one in the family would ever say the words that she was lost to suicide. Everyone knew it. Everyone knew it, but no one would say it.
Okay.
But my brother and I, unfortunately, were there and found her. So there's no question. Like, everyone knows what happened. But because no one would say it, it made us, even though we were still fairly young, feel like we should feel ashamed of it and we should feel guilty about it. And so it didn't allow us to feel like we could ask questions about it, learn about it, educate ourselves on why it might happen and about, mental illness to try to help other people. So it wasn't until I was well into adulthood, and I would say certainly after we had our children, probably in my 30s, that I really started to come to terms with it more and reach a point where I instead of feeling abandoned and betrayed and hurt and angry, I really just started feeling like I felt forgiveness for her, and I felt understanding, and then I just felt sad. I felt sad that someone could reach a point that they had such a mental illness at that point with depression that they didn't feel like they could go on. And I realized that it wasn't a choice that she made. That's not a choice. So the important point that I want to make about having a child who's a parent to suicide is, those emotions are so complex, and I do think it would have been extremely helpful and healing for me if my dad and other family members would have said the words and gave us permission, my brother and I, permission to talk about it and explore it and learn more about it, because I wonder if it would have gotten me to that point of acceptance and forgiveness a lot sooner than what I was able to get there.
Yeah. Oh, that makes a lot of sense. And, in your case, as you said, you were a little bit older and you actually found your mom, so there was no denying it. I know in some cases, maybe with even younger children, sometimes the parents or the people around them don't even tell them the truth about the cause of death. And maybe they tell them, they had a heart attack or something because they're afraid to tell them the truth about suicide.
Yeah, and I'll tell you the other thing that I believe is really dangerous about that is mental health is just that. It's health. And it's really important for kids to know their family medical history. And so think about what a shame that would be if there was a parent that had struggled with mental illness at all, but let alone to the point of having lost them to that, and for the child to go on and maybe experience some of the same things and be struggling, but not talk about it because they don't understand what it is, or they don't feel like they can, that it's not accepted. And so then they don't get the help that they need either. I mean, it really is medical history that kids need to know.
Right, and share with their doctors or their mental health professionals as a relevant piece of information.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Let's see. Gosh. Well, here's an interesting question. Do you think there's any unexpected ways that you've grown as a result of losing your mom at age 19?
I do. So, the one thing that I think was the best silver lining, right, of the situation is that it really has made me empathetic to the feelings of other people. So there's an understanding that you get from having experienced that kind of loss that no one else could have. And so it puts you in a position, for me, of being able to do a couple of things. One is to be able to reach out and connect with other people, other children that have had that kind of a loss. And it's so powerful for them to be able to hear, not just an adult telling them that it's going to be okay or trying to help them, but to actually have an adult say, I understand because the same thing happened to me. Like, I'm not just telling you I understand, I've been there. I really, really do. There's power in that. so I think that there's a level of understanding there that you can't have unless, as myself and a couple of my friends who have been there as well, we kind of jokingly say that you're a member of the club, right? You're either in the club or you're not.
Right.
The other thing, though, that it's done for me is I know that there have been triggering points for me over the years where it has really affected my ability to be able to trust people, to let people in. And so when I'm dealing with people, I'm open to understanding that there likely is something else underlying there, right? We all have stories that we carry with us. And so we don't know what those stories are of other people. Most people certainly don't know that this is a story that I carry with me. I mean, they will now, right? But that's okay. But, just if you're feeling frustrated with the way that someone is behaving, or they feel, it feels like, they're not someone that would want to let someone in, or, it feels like they're kind of cold. Really what it's done for me is make me understand that there's probably a reason for that. And then I just start to wonder what that is. And I'm just more open and accepting, I hope, for people.
Okay. And what you were just saying reminded me of something that you mentioned when we were talking previous to this discussion about not wanting to be perceived as too girly. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so that was an interesting outcome over the last year. So my entire adult life, I have had this persona that I'm strong, I'm independent, I don't need anyone to help take care of me. God bless my husband because he's okay with being married to a strong, stubborn at times woman. But in addition to that, I've never labeled myself as a, quote, girly woman, right? And so I would never allow myself to be able to like things that I perceive to be overly feminine. I would look at things in the store and think they were really pretty, but I wouldn't allow myself to take them home because, they just weren't me. They weren't me. Mm. And through this kind of self-reflection that I've been doing over the last year, what I came to realize was that I wasn't allowing myself to like those things because I didn't want to be perceived as weak, because that was my coping mechanism. I'm strong. I can deal with this. I'm just going to keep plowing along, overachieving. So it sounds so kind of ridiculous to say, but a really healing moment for me over the last year was going into a store and buying this soft raspberry colored blanket for our living room and these kind of plush pillows for the living room. And I remember bringing them home and pulling them out of the bag. My husband was in the living room, and I felt like I had to make like this proclamation. I pulled them out of the bag and I said, I bought these for the living room because I really like them, and I'm going to put them in the living room. And I remember him sitting there and going, okay.
Uh-huh.
But it was so silly. But now, so that's been last, a year ago. And every time I look at that blanket and those pillows, it makes me smile, because I think that was the first time that I gave myself permission to do something that, to me, even though it would seem ridiculous to other people, it felt vulnerable.
Yeah.
It felt vulnerable.
Yeah. That's awesome. I love that story. So this then is reminding me, you mentioned how helpful your therapist has been in helping you process. And so I'm wondering, I think you mentioned you have a great therapist that you love. How to find a great therapist? I mean, did you have to interview 10 different people, or how? Do you have any tips on finding a therapist that you really click with?
So for me, I did some online research looking for therapists in our area. And what was great was that there's a biography for all of them that I found that explained what they specialized in, what they had studied, and then what their special interests were. And so for me, that was the place that I started. I was looking for someone who had some kind of a specialization and or interest in childhood trauma,
Okay.
because that to me feels like something that's so unique that it was important for me to know that I was working with someone who kind of got it, right? I mean, there are probably a lot of fantastic therapists that you could work with and they would get it. But that was one of the things that I looked for. The other things that I looked for then after that, you're right. I mean, you have to be comfortable with the person. So there was one person that I saw that, I don't know, it didn't feel right to me. I didn't feel that comfort. I didn't feel that connection. I felt like I was kind of there for an interview. She wasn't able, and this is probably on my end, she wasn't able to get me to put my guard down. So that's not a match, right? I mean, so I did end up, the second person that I saw, I kind of expected the same thing. And actually, when I was sitting there in her office, I literally told her, I really don't want to be here. My husband said I need to be here. So I'm here, but just so you know, this isn't what I want to do. I'm a really private person. I don't like to talk about my feelings. And she was just like, that's fine. That's okay. No problem. And it turned into a 2-hour session where I just completely opened up about everything. So, at the end of that, I knew this is my person.
Yeah.
This is my person.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I did. I mean, I started my research online looking for someone who specialized in the thing that I was experiencing.
Right. Okay. That makes a lot of sense. I know and I happen to have found a therapist that I love. One of the things that I think is hard though, is like once you start down a path with somebody, it takes so much energy to start opening up. And then if you find maybe it's not a good match, then the thought of the energy required to start over with somebody else seems to me a little daunting anyway.
Well, yeah, I totally agree. And so that's for me, the reason why I just had a gut feel, like I said, that first meeting that I had, when I didn't feel like it was going to be a good match, then I found someone else who was a better match, because you're right. I mean, you're just emotionally exhausted after those sessions, right? You can't imagine backing up and having to share those stories again.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. Gosh, I think we could keep talking about this for a long time here, but I think we are running short of time. Just a few more questions. What do you wish your mom knew about you today?
I think, wow, that is a really great question. I wish that if my mom could know one thing, it's that I understand now and I forgive her. Not that I even feel that she needs forgiveness for what happened, but I would just really want her to know, I understand, I get it now, and it's okay.
And if you could say one thing to your younger self, what would that be?
To let other people in.
To
let other people in, let other people help, and you don't have to carry it all by yourself. Talk about it and let other people help you on that journey. And, maybe I'll leave you with this. I do remember when shortly after my mom had died, being in a doctor's office. This was completely a coincidence because it was just a doctor's appointment. But I picked up a brochure that was on a rack in there, and it caught my eye because on the front of it, it said, "Forgive yourself for being human." And it really resonated with me because, with those feelings that I was carrying so strongly at that time of shame, guilt, abandonment, betrayal, but with an emphasis on the guilt, what if I had called that day? What if I had spent more time? What if, right? Those are the games we play in our head. And I remember picking that up, and I carried that around with me for years because that phrase, "forgive yourself for being human," was really comforting to me. That whatever it is that you're carrying that you wish that you could have, would have, should have done after the loss of a parent, it's okay. You're human. Forgive yourself.
Yeah. Okay. That's a great thing to keep in mind. And so just one last final question for my listeners here. If you could say one thing to adults who might have a grieving child in their life, what would you say to them?
I would say to make sure that you are checking in with them regularly. And even if they tell you that they're okay, they're probably not. And so it's our job as adults to fill that role of being the adult in that relationship and get them the help that they need. So don't allow them to withdraw into themselves. Don't allow them to pull away from the family because they're feeling uncomfortable and think that they just need some space or some time. What they really need is you, even if it's just sitting with them.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you so much. I think that's a great place to end. My guest today is Kris Marsh, who lost her mom when she was just 19 years old. And Kris, thank you so much for speaking with me today.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity to share the story. I appreciate it.
I hope you enjoyed my interview with Kris Marsh as much as I did. You can find show notes and all the links at widowedparentpodcast.com. Look for episode 25. And a quick note, I'm going to create my first YouTube video in my Cars 101 series in the next few days, so be on the lookout for it on social media. If we're not connected, you can find me on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. The links are on my website, jennylisk.com. That's JENNYLISK. I'm working on an episode on home maintenance and other house-related topics, and in the course of working on that, some people suggested they also wanted to know about basic car stuff. This is so important for two reasons. First, we should know how to care for our homes and cars, and we may not if our late spouses tended to handle those tasks. Second, our kids need to learn adulting skills. So even if you know how to use jumper cables or unclog your toilet, this just might be a great chance to teach your kids too. So look for the first video on cars on Facebook Live and then on YouTube. One last thing, I've put together a guide with some of the key things I've learned from my guests so far on the podcast. You can download it free at jennylisk.com/top10. Thanks for listening. Until next week, keep smiling.
Thank you for listening to the Widowed Parent Podcast with your host, Jenny Lisk. Connect with us on social media and at widowedparentpodcast.com.